This video is sponsored by the Friendly Fire team and their Winter 40K League. More about them later on. What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and this is another episode of the Best Armies in Warhammer 40K, the weekly video series where we go through undefeated results from the last week of competitive play. And this was an absolute barn burner of a weekend with massive results both from the Team 40K side. I am currently on the road back from the Tennessee Elite Open Teams of 8 edition. This was a 26-team, 8-player team tournament where I live streamed the entire thing, including some absolutely incredible matches between top-level teams. If you want to see some Team 40K, go check out the live tab on my channel for my coverage of that. But we also saw things like the Las Vegas team tournament, so massive amounts of team results this weekend. But we're focusing in this series on singles play, and we saw huge tournaments like the Nottingham Super Major go down. Although at the time of recording, it's actually not yet complete, so we won't be covering that on this video. I will be talking about it in content later on this week, however. But we saw massive numbers of GTs, most of which are using the new updates from last week, changing Ultramarines and especially things like Victrix Honor Guard. We even see the appearance of some of the new units like the Wardens of Ultramar. Now, with that in mind, we move on to a metagame breakdown, and we can see immediately that those new releases are taking the metagame by storm, with Necrons as the new top placer. Now, Ultramarines would be up here as well, but I'm going to do something a little bit non-standard this week because many of the Ultramarine lists did use the old update point values for their units. Victrix Honor Guard at 4 wounds at 240 points rather than 3 wounds at 220 points. I elected to not include any Ultramarine results that were using the old values. So Ultramarines with their new update only had one result this week, which used some of the new data sheets and things. However, they would otherwise be more heavily represented. And we'll see in future weeks, once more events start to adopt the new updates, how far Ultramarines go with their new changes. Now, that said, Chaos Daemons are up there with Necrons with 3 undefeated results, both at the Grand Onslaught 11 and Exterminatus 11. Now, interestingly, Exterminatus 11 was 2 Scintillating Legion armies in the finals there as the 2 undefeated players. However, the Grand Onslaught 11 had, interestingly, not Scintillating Legion, it had Plague Legion, which I'm excited to talk about. Astra Militarum also doing fairly well with their Grizzled Company detachment at New Year's Knockout and the Resolution GT. Thousand Suns took down the Dawn of Reckoning as well as 40k Brawl Breachhead Warm-Up. That's a fascinating non-Fulgrim list that's focusing a little bit heavier on monsters and vehicles, which is really interesting to see. So excited to talk about that. Seems like Thousand Suns are maybe slowly but surely coming out of the doldrums of their multiple nerfs over the last couple of updates. And then we have a bunch of factions with single undefeated results. Ultramarines, as I mentioned before, at the Copenhagen Chainsword GT2. We also see Space Marines represented by Salamanders at New Year's Knockout, running Forge Father Seekers. Grey Knights at the Grand Onslaught 11. Death Guard at the Dragon's Reach GT. And last but certainly not least, a Fulgrim-toting Emperor's Children list at the Winter Assault event. And with that, we're going to dive into these lists just after a word from our sponsor. This video has been sponsored by the Friendly Fire team. Are you looking to hone your 40k skills online and get points for the T5S2 online ranking circuit? Well, you can do so at the Friendly Fire team's Winter 40k League. Now, we've talked about Friendly Fire team on the channel in the past. They're an Israel-based group of wargamers who run events locally and online for a wide variety of miniature games, and they are most recently running a 4-round league beginning in January. Sign-ups for this event end the 24th of January and are available to players all around the world. Games will be played on Tabletop Simulator using WTC rules and missions, allowing you to get reps for team events. In addition to that, there's a smorgasbord of prizes available for participants, including a wide variety of raffle prizes and prizes for players placing in the top 3. So check the links down in the video description for the event registration page, as well as a link to the Friendly Fire team's Discord server. Signups close the 24th of January, so make sure you get those registrations in now, and I'll see you on the digital battlefield. So starting off with our metagame frontrunners, the Necrons from the New Year's Knockout 2026. Now, this was a massive 100-player event that did only run 5 rounds, so it ended up with 3 undefeated results, and we're going to be talking about all of them on this episode. But the most interesting one is Necrons with a brand new detachment from the Wednesday drop last week, the Pantheon of Woe. Now, for those who don't know, this is a brand new detachment that grants all the Catan in the army a 6-inch aura that improves armor penetration characteristics, targeting enemies within 6 inches of them. Since the Catan tend to be aggressive and relatively short range, that basically permanently gives them all, or at least most of their attacks, +1 AP. The army's also including Triarch Stalkers, so it can further compound that +1 AP with a cover ignoring effect from the Stalkers themselves. Now, the other thing that this detachment does is it actually makes your Catan shards more expensive by applying additional abilities to them. That's why if you look at the points values of these units, they are higher than they would normally be according to the Metagame Field Manual. This includes a 6-inch deep strike for Transcendent Catan, which allows them to set up closer than normal to enemies. The Deceiver gets a 12-inch Lord of Deceit aura, a command point tax aura. The Nightbringer is able to advance and charge. The Void Dragon forces enemy vehicles units within line of sight to take a leadership test, potentially giving them -1 to hit and wound at the start of the opponent's shooting phase. Now, what's interesting is that a lot of the stratagems in this detachment don't necessarily affect the monsters themselves. There are a couple that do, but a lot of times they are to affect other units that are nearby the monsters. But generally speaking, the Catan shards themselves, especially with these additional benefits, are good enough to carry the game regardless of other things going on. However, the detachment can do things like allow the Catan shards to deadly demise on a 3+ rather than a 6, to force enemies to take battle shock checks in the command phase if they are visible to any of the monsters. They take mortal wounds if they fail, and in addition to that, obviously are battle shocked, and that can prevent them from holding objectives, or it can score you objectives. I imagine that's where a lot of the command points of this detachment are going. There are also some interesting stratagems that allow you to, for example, reanimate units that are nearby monsters when the monsters destroy things. So when the Catan shards kill something, you can target the Triarch Stalker to give them a reanimation, and given that the Triarch Stalkers themselves are high OC, 4+ a vulnerable save, relatively high wounds count for a cheap cost, being able to reanimate those guys multiple times is pretty helpful. You can also fight on death with the Catan shards or the Stalkers if you want to, but generally you won't, and you can force enemies to take battle shock checks when they fall back. Not massive buffs for the Catan, but the big benefit are those additional effects that the Pantheon of Woe gives them, especially things like the command point tax aura on the Deceiver, as well as the close deep strikes for the Transcendent Catan, allow them to get into awkward situations much more easily, and especially with the ability to advance, redeploy themselves 6 inches away from enemies, and potentially put 4 OC and or battle shock an enemy that are holding an objective is a big deal. The list is also including, in addition to the Catan shard of the Deceiver, Nightbringer, Void Dragon, and 2 Transcendent Catan, alongside the 2 Triarch Stalkers that I mentioned previously, a Catacomb Command Barge, which is going to be able to improve the OC characteristic of all those units by 1. The awkward part, especially for Catan shards in the metagame currently, is that they come in at slightly lower OC than especially greater demons. So when you fight into matches like Scintillating Legion, you actually get out OC'd very quickly, even by the weedier ranged demons like Lords of Change. And so being able to pump those guys up to OC 5 allows you to fight other high OC enemies better, as well as fight those single entities that are also high objective control characteristic. The Command Barge itself can also make use of things like that reactive reanimation when you destroy units, so he can be kept alive a little bit longer than normal too. So interesting inclusion there. So interesting to see the new Catan data sheets doing well. This is not the only list out of the Necron lists that went undefeated this weekend that were using the new Catan data sheets. There were a couple other Catan focused lists that did fairly well this weekend, and I'm sure that this is not the last we're going to be seeing of not only Pantheon of Woe, but also these Catan focused armies. Now, moving on to our next top placing faction, that's going to be Chaos Daemons. We did see some very strong results from Scintillating Legion this week. That is not super surprising because that's been doing fairly well over the course of the week. And honestly, I expected some nerfs to Lords of Change if we were going to nerf Victrix Underguard at the same time, but we didn't get those. And I think that Scintillating Legion is going to be continuously doing well as we move on into the future. We'll see how they do against Necrons. They do tend to have fairly decent profiles, even into the -1 damage Catan shards, but we'll see how they do in an updated metagame here. They are significantly better into 3-wound Victrix Underguard, though, and that's just going to simply improve the stocks of Chaos Demons. That said, the list we're going to talk about today is Plague Legion instead of being Scintillating Legion. We saw Sam Hellman at the Grand Onslaught 11 take down that event with the Battle Shock-focused Nurgle Demon detachment, which is really cool. For those who don't know, because we might not have talked about this detachment in a while, this projects a 9-inch aura of Shadow of Chaos for enemies from all of your Nurgle demons and allows you to force a Battle Shock check on one unit of your choice in each player's command phase, allowing you to deal damage or change objective control on units just based on their proximity to you. We're taking here a Demon Prince of Nurgle with a Droning Shroud that gives him an 18-inch lone operative effect, similar to Bellicor. So Nurgle demons within 6 inches of him gain an 18-inch lone operative when they're nearby him. The big benefit there is it allows you to deploy your otherwise ponderous, heavy Nurgle Greater Demons out in the open from the early game without necessarily being in range of your opponent's entire gun line, which can be pretty deleterious to their health. We have Epidemius, which is a pretty natural inclusion to generate command points in a almost entirely Nurgle demon army, because most of your kills are going to be from Nurgle demons. Just naturally, Epidemius is going to be able to up his tally very quickly. We have a Great Unclean One with Font of Spores that provides a +1 AP bonus within 6 inches of him, which affects all attacks, in fact, not just your melee attacks, but as long as you're a Nurgle demon, it affects your ranged attacks as well, allowing this Nurgle demon armies to create kind of a solid gun line, but also just puts things like Rodigus and the Great Unclean One's spray attacks, their torrent weapons, up to AP3, which is actually pretty spooky. We have another unupgraded Great Unclean One alongside 2 Pox Bringers. These are the unit champions for your Plague Bearers and gives them 5+ critical hits, so it allows them to unleash their lethal hits on a 5 instead of just a 6. When you're combining that with effects like +1 AP from Font of Spores, that can actually get some serious damage out of those guys. We then also have a Sloppy Bile Piper with Canker Blight, which is going to force enemies that fail Battle Shock checks within 6 inches of him to lose an entire model from their unit rather than taking mortal wounds thanks to the army ability. So the benefit here is that the Sloppy Bile Piper is going to force Battle Shock checks in the fight phase, every fight phase, so potentially forcing 2 during a single battle round. You can also force 2 additional thanks to the Plague Legion detachment ability, and each one of those can be removing a model. So when you're talking about dealing with things like Victrix Honor Guard, things like Terminator Squads, when they're forcing 3-4 leadership checks on a unit, there's a pretty solid chance they fail 2 or 3 of those. Each one of them is going to destroy a very heavy, expensive infantry model from the unit. So that once that guy's value stacks up, it gets pretty spooky. We have a unit of Blue Horrors. These guys are very efficient infiltrators. They can infiltrate up in the center of the table to prevent enemies from infiltrating themselves, so you can stop jail effects, or you can jail yourself with them. We have 2 Nurgling Swarms as to act as additional infiltrators and utility units. We have 3 Plague Bearer squads. Those guys are going to attach to the characters and just generally provide massive amounts of OC to the army. They're difficult to kill, especially with the number of Great Unclean Ones in the army. They go to toughness 6, so they're tough to punch through. And then once you start to regenerate them, they can switch OC on objectives very easily. And then we have some additional utility provided by 3 Beasts of Nurgle. Those guys are going to be able to scout unrestricted with the massive number of infiltrators that the detachment is bringing. Very cool to see these Nurgle demon armies doing well. Obviously, the massive amounts of attrition that you can be provided by the Plague Bearers plus the 3 Great Unclean Ones can chew through a lot of armies, and especially if you can prevent them from shooting early, you can do things like screen the 18-inch from your front line, the units affected by Droning Shroud, with the Blue Horrors on turn 1, so there's literally no way that your opponent can shoot you on turn 1, and that gives you an opportunity to move up the board and stage. You can also move your Greater Demons through walls in this detachment, so as long as you can find a good hiding place for a Nurgle Greater Demon, Great Unclean One, you can start to threaten mid-board objectives very early from round 1 or round 2 onwards. That allows it to play more aggressively, and once you get those Great Unclean Ones stuck in, they're able to project that aura of Shadow of Chaos to enemies. You can force enough Battle Shock checks that the army ability actually starts forcing tons of damage onto otherwise hard to kill units. So extremely cool army. Always cool to see these Plague Legion lists doing well. And shout out to Sam for taking down an undefeated record with them. Now, with that, we're going to move over to one of our other frontrunners this week, and kind of a surprising faction, that being Thousand Suns. These guys have been on a tough spot for the last couple of weeks since their multiple nerfs previously. However, they've been holding on, and this week actually doing pretty well. And we're going to be talking about Isian Clifford James from the 40K Brawl Beachhead Warm-Up event, who went 5-0, winning the event with a Magnus-less Grand Coven list. You'll notice that there are no Demon Primarchs in this particular build, which is fascinating for the Thousand Suns. This includes a Demon Prince of Tzeentch with wings, with the Eldritch Vortex of Attack, so the +1 damage effect, which will give him the bonus damage to both his melee weapon as well as his magic spell. We have 3 sorcerers. One of them does have the Umberlific Crystal, so it can redeploy in a single Zangor Shaman. From there, we are spamming massive numbers of Rubric Marines. We have 3 sorcerers, so we can attach sorcerers to 3 Rubric Marine units, but we are in fact bringing 4 of them, all of those equipped with a Soul Reaper cannon and 3 Warp Flamers. We do have 2 Chaos Rhinos to carry around all of those Rubric Marines. The Rhinos can obviously give the +1 to wounds effect, which will affect all the psychic attacks in the unit, including the sorcerers attached. And then the sorcerer will benefit from the rerolls from the Rubric Marines themselves. But we also have a Forge Fiend, as well as a pair of Maulerfiends, a pair of Mutalisk Vortex Beasts, and a couple of Zangor units for utility. Now, interestingly, we're taking these Maulerfiends for some dedicated anti-tank. So instead of relying on Magnus to deal damage at range, we don't need to spend all of the command points on him in order to buff up his attacks. He really wants to be a focal point for your command points, but if we have all of those remaining, we can do things like more easily strategic reserve units and rapid ingress them, and do things like hold more command points to buff up units like the Demon Prince of Tzeentch, using Destined by Fate to prevent damage on him, for example, or even focusing full reroll stratagems on him himself, or we can spend a CP even to put any of the sorcerers back into a previous doctrine that we've already used for the army, allowing them to get +1 to wound or devastating wounds outside of the normal turn in which we would use that doctrine. So without focusing all of the stratagems on Magnus himself, we can spread them out a little bit more evenly. In addition to that, the Maulerfiends are also beneficial for this army that is focusing very heavily on Psykers. They get charge rerolls for free if they target something engaged by a Psyker. So for example, we can do something like send in the Zangor Shaman, charge an enemy unit, and then try to make longer charges with the Maulerfiends because you get those natural rerolls, which is kind of helpful. Those guys will also act as a very nice backline unit who can counterpunch into units that are trying to engage with the sorcerers. So the sorcerers themselves can access pretty long threat range by extending their own range with the detachment ability or the stratagem. You can then push forward and disembark from the Rhino, double move them after that to try to get line of sight to enemies, and then beef them up. You follow that up with a Maulerfiend. Enemies come in to try to kill the sorcerer. You can try to protect them with Destined by Fate, and then the Maulerfiend can come in and counterattack whatever comes in. They can also heroically intervene for free in the situations where that's relevant as well. A nice, relatively cheap inclusion, and can stack a lot of the defensive stats that otherwise Thousand Sons don't typically have access to. Absolutely fascinating list. Definitely cool not to see the classic Magnus build on the table for Grand Covenant, but it's exciting to see more varied builds for Thousand Sons succeed. Now, moving back for a moment to the New Year's Knockout, we can talk about the ultimate winner of that event. Dan Salmons ended up taking it down on tiebreakers using Astra Militarum in a Grizzled Company. Now, a lot of Grizzled Companies lists are looking fairly similar these days. They're taking a combination of aggressive infantry units, a little bit of deep striking, in addition to cavalry units that can benefit extremely effectively from the rerolls that you get, since they tend to be low quantity, high volume attacks, which really needs the rerolls to be consistent, as well as a bunch of vehicles and artillery. That all being said, he was taking a Cadian command squad, Gaunt's Ghosts. The benefit there of Gaunt's Ghosts, obviously, is that they get to redeploy themselves every turn, so they can set up at the end of the movement phase and then immediately reapply orders. So you can do things like use either the Rogaldorn Commanders. Lord Leontis is also in this list, so you have massive numbers of very broad orders that can go on almost anyone. And then, to give them things like Move, 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 for example, you could then drop the Gaunt's Ghosts next to them and replace that Move, Move, Move order with something like First Rank Fire, Second Rank Fire, or Fix Bayonets. So the additional orders, we're making the most use of these additional orders that are made possible by the detachment as much as we can. Lord Leontis is there, plus a Rogaldorn tank commander. The Rogaldorn commander is going to issue orders for most of the vehicles in the army, but the downside is that he doesn't have a huge range on his order issuing capacity. However, Lord Leontis can combo join with the Cadian command squad into a unit of Cadian shock troopers who are already there, and then he can use the Master Vox in the unit to project orders on almost anything in the army up to 24 inches. So we have massive numbers of orders available from that unit onto both the infantry and the vehicles, in addition to the Rogaldorn buffing whatever is around him. And then any of that infantry or regiment units that do need orders after the fact can get it from Gaunt's Ghosts at the end of the movement phase. So massive amounts of order flexibility, and all of those orders are then going to be unlocking the reroll ones to hit for all of these units, and then potentially the reroll ones to wound if you target enemies on objectives. From there, we're also bringing a pair of Death Rider squads for for some utility. We have Adeline Rough Rider unit for counterpunch. Those guys with fixed bayonets can go absolutely insane. And if we can do the classic thing of giving them an additional 3 inches of movement with move, 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 getting them into position, replacing move, move, move with fixed bayonets, and then charging them into melee, probably hitting and wounding on 2s against a lot of targets with rerolls 1-to-1 to hit and wound. So those guys go absolutely nuts. We then have a field ordnance battery, 3 Leman Wasser Vanquishers with the number of vehicle orders that we have in the list. The Vanquishers tend to be very popular for this particular detachment. They do go crazy with rerolls, making their big cannon shots more effective, but they're also, just for 145 points for the Leman Russ defensive profile, is absolutely insane and pulls a lot of focus from the Rogel Dorn tanks themselves, which is where a lot of the sustained damage comes from. We then have a second Rogel Dorn. Those are buffed by 3 Scout Sentinels and a unit of Tempestus Aquilons for utility. Pretty vehicle-focused variety of Astra Militarum, but we are seeing most of these Grizzled Company lists take a very similar route, although the inclusion of Lord Solar Leontis in this case is actually pretty cool. It's been a while since we've seen him, but I was actually surprised when Grizzled Company came out and he wasn't very widely played, because it seems like extra orders that can target almost anything in the army is hugely beneficial. From there, we're going to move over to Space Marines for a while and talk about the Copenhagen Chainsword GT. This was won by Alexander Falt Zukov, who was playing a Gladius Task Force Ultramarines list. Not too surprising, but what was surprising is the composition of the list. So it was using the new Victrix Honor Guard points level at 110 points for a unit of 3, and actually spamming those units to the maximum field allowance, up to 3 units of 3 Victrix Honor Guard. That's to attach the maximum number of captains that we have available. So we have a standard captain, as well as Sicarius, Marnius Calgar, and Uriel Ventress. We have attachments for all of those Victrix Honor Guard units, in addition to a company hero squad. We can carry some of that to the battle with an impulsor, probably to carry Captain Sicarius around, because he's going to give his unit scout. And then we're backing that up with some pretty solid shooting profiles. We have 2 Redemptor Dreadnoughts, as well as a pair of Vindicators. Now, it's interesting we're taking the Redemptor Dreadnoughts and the Vindicators in a non-Blades of Ultramar list, but with how aggressive and melee-oriented this list is, with trying to get those combat characters into melee, having Fight on Death from Only in Death's Duty and from the standard Gladius Task Force is actually going to be hugely beneficial for this list. Now, we also have a Combi Lieutenant with Artificer Armor, so he's difficult to take down. That's a nice little points filler for that guy as well. And then, interestingly, we have the brand new Wardens of Ultramar unit. Now, this unit is pretty wild. For only 90 points, you get 20 wounds. They all come in at toughness 4 because they're a non-attached unit, so you always use the highest toughness characteristic in the unit. Obviously, there are rules in specific that will prevent that from happening. The case for bodyguards with a higher toughness character, that the bodyguard toughness supersedes that, and Deathwatch kill teams use the majority toughness in the unit. But the standard rule, which comes up very rarely, is that you always use the highest toughness characteristic in the unit. And in this case, that means that the 2 Space Marines in the unit, Gadriel and Metaurus, will up the toughness of the entire unit when being interacted with to 4. The other thing is that as long as they have Gadriel in the unit, and he's probably going to be one of the last ones that you remove, they get an OC bonus. So you're bringing 6 models with a total of 20 wounds at toughness 4. You have 3 wounds on the non-Space Marine models, and then 4 wounds in the 2 Space Marine models inside the unit. All of those go to OC2. There's no Titus in this list, so they don't get their additional leadership bonus. However, they do provide a redeployment effect, which works even if they are inside a transport, and they can even go into that impulsor. You would think that because the impulsor can only really transport power-armored Primaris infantry, it wouldn't be able to occupy the non-Space Marine models inside the unit, but for whatever reason, the non-Space Marine models inside the unit gained the Tacticus keyword. So they're able to embark into Tacticus allowing vehicles, like things like the Impulsor. So this unit can, assume what's happening is that the unit either starts inside the Impulsor and can still use its redeployment effect, or you begin Sicarius' unit inside the Impulsor and scout it, and then once Sicarius commits, you can replace it with these models, and then they can push forward to put mass OC into the center of the table. Very difficult to kill OC as well. As soon as you apply any additional defensive mechanics to these guys, if you have anything like the -1 to wound in Blade of Ultramar, for example, the unit becomes actually very difficult to take down. Insanely wild unit. Very cool to see them doing well already upon their release, but it's definitely going to take... It's going to, I'm sure, surprise some people how difficult this unit is to remove and how good they are at controlling objectives. Not to mention the fact that they're actually incredibly efficient in terms of attack volume. The models inside the unit have between 4 and 5 attacks individually, they're all 2+ weapon skill. And so when they're fighting things like light infantry or even small units of medium infantry, they can actually punch through them pretty quickly. The basic humans inside the unit, for whatever reason, have a base strength of 4 and a 2+ weapon skill. It's pretty crazy. They actually put out kind of an insane amount of damage. So those guys are being backed up by the 9 Victrix Honor Guard plus all the attached characters. You have a million of these little trading units that can push all the way around the table, in addition to the heavy vehicles that are supporting the army from a range standpoint. Very cool list. Very nice to see all these new data sheets still being used. And I'm sure we're going to see more use of them once we have more events using the new updates that came out this past week. Last Space Marine list we're going to be talking about today comes again from the New Year's Knockout. This is going to be the last time we talk about this particular event. I'm finally done with it. But this is Josh Lewis on Salamanders, also going 5-0 and taking second place in that event. And I love to see this because he was playing Salamanders in Forgefather Seekers, which is a detachment that I've basically been playing exclusively since I released my How to Play Salamanders video a couple of weeks ago. I talked very extensively about this detachment in that video, so please go check that out if you want a guide to how to play armies very similar to this one. But in this case, he was focusing very heavily on Infernus Marines and Librarian, which is not a direction that I expected the detachment to go in. The nice thing here is that the Librarians provide a 4+ invulnerable save to large Infernus Marine squads, in addition to giving them a pretty solid ranged attack that obviously benefits from the detachment ability, so getting assault and a potentially +1 strength. So we're running 2 Librarians. One of them has Immolator, so +1 attack to all of your Torrent weapons, which are going to affect the Infernus Marines in their squads, and another one with Forged in Battle, which allows you to flip a hit or a saving throw to a 6 once per turn. That allows them to keep the Infernus Marines alive a little bit longer. Unfortunately, they don't have any critical effects or anything like that outside of devastating wounds on their wound roll, but Forged in Battle very specifically cannot be used on the wound roll, so it can't be used in conjunction with devastating wounds, but you can convert hits with it, and you can save more often with them. On top of that, we have a Combi Lieutenant and Vulcan Heston alongside Adrax Agatone. So we're running both of the epic heroes from the sub-faction. We have a Blade Guard Veteran Squad for Adrax to hop into, so they can give him reroll once to hit, and he can give them rerolls to wound. We then have a Company Hero Squad for Vulcan Heston, plus an Intercessor Squad for the backline. From there, the rest of the list is basically, besides 1 Scout Squad for utility, the rest of the list is basically vehicles and massive Infernus bricks. So we're running 2 units of 10 Infernus Marines, those guys both equipped with the Librarians, so we can play them a little bit more aggressively, and they don't die quite as quickly as you would normally expect. The nice thing in this detachment is because we have Vulcan Heston, they get OC2 and they can perform actions and still shoot. So you can use them to really just like push the primary super heavily. You can push up their transports up to the center of the table, use Burning Vengeance on anything attacking them to put some serious damage on the swing back, steal the objectives away, tank incoming hits on the 4+ invulnerable save, and then even if you draw secondaries like recover assets, cleanse, all that stuff, the Infernus Squad's still going to be able to perform those actions while shooting. Pretty cool. On top of that, we have a Gladiator Lancer for some long-range punch, and then the actual transports are a pair of Repulsors plus a Land Raider Redeemer. The nice thing about the Repulsors here is that because most of these guys are automatically hitting and benefiting from the Forgefather buff from Vulcan Heston, you don't necessarily need Oath of Moment on a lot of their attacks. So between the 1 Lancer and then the long-range guns from the Repulsors, you can usually take out heavy armor with Oath of Moment applied to your longer ranged attacks, and then you have lots and lots of ways to buff the closer ranged attacks. So the Infernus Marines can get Vulcan Heston's buff. Adrax Agatone's unit can usually just use Crucible of Battle +1 to wound to get some serious damage in. So ultimately, the army's going to be focused on these 3 huge T12 vehicles, using all of the vehicle synergies that the detachment has available to push these Infernus Marines and these melee units up to the center of the table and just try to dominate that midboard and make use of the Salamander's absolutely ruinous damage within 12 inches. And I do think that there's going to be a lot of benefits to taking this particular detachment with units like these Infernus Squads if we see a heavier incidence of things like Catan Shards in the future. The Immolator brick with devastating wounds, wound rerolls, and +1 attack from the attached character is going to do insane damage to things like Catan that would normally reduce incoming damage, but they don't care because they're all 1 damage, and a lot of those wounds are going to be devastating. You can cook most of a Catan Shard with just one of these units, and then hopefully follow up with your other attacks to actually finish it off. So going to be very helpful if you are talking about a new and improved metagame where we are looking at these big monsters being very successful. Now, moving on, we're going to go back to the Grand Onslaught 11, where we already talked about Chaos Demons taking a 5-0 record. And kind of hilariously, they were dodged by Grey Knights, who ended up not hunting the demons to take them down, but instead also went 5-0 themselves with a Warpbane Task Force. Now, this is David Ozawa, who I've live streamed several times at the Crucible. Him on both my secondary table that for YouTube channel members, you should have access to those games if you are a member of the channel, but also on my main stream when I streamed Crucible this past October, and he was playing a very similar list. In fact, I don't think his list has changed very much at all. He was playing Warpbane Task Force, playing a trio of Brotherhood Librarians, plus a Castellan Crow, and a pair of Grandmaster Nemesis Dread Knights. And to be clear, those Grandmaster Nemesis Dread Knights are rocking their heavy side cannons and sublimators, the anti-tank loadout, plus a Nemesis Demon Great Hammer for melee. So those guys are going to be acting as some of the sort of counterpunch anti-tank ability of the army. The rest of the army is going to be made up of vehicles and smaller units that can skirmish with infantry. Now, the big interesting part here is the three Brotherhood Librarians. These guys are very nice little utility pieces. They're only 80 points for a single entity 40 mil based model, so they can deep strike in weird places where your opponent might not be able to entirely screen them. And then they come in with that Vortex of Doom, which can do some serious damage, potentially all by itself, especially with rerolls from the Warpbane Task Force detachment ability. So all three of them with their powers combined can usually knock out a unit of 5 models, for example, pretty easily, assuming they don't shoot themselves out of range or line of sight. And then you can follow up with the remainder of the units to clear out other utility stuff, or these guys can just redeploy and do actions and things, and you're not really giving up a huge unit of 5 Grey Knights, which can cost, upwards of 130 points. From there, we are running Castellan Crow with a big unit of Purifiers. These guys equipped with silencers, so they're going to be doing massive numbers of anti-infantry damage. The big benefit of the silencers over something like an incinerator is that the silencers can operate from 24 inches away, so you're able to peek weird lines of sight from these guys around corners and things without having to expose the entire unit to the entirety of your opponent's shooting. So you can use them more often than you would a standard loadout for Purifiers, which is either focusing on melee or on the short-range flamer weapons. Whereas that might do more damage, the silencers themselves are pretty good into anti-infantry rolls, and they have enough attack volume that they can force saves on a lot of stuff, but they can also do so from long enough away that your opponent not be able to counterattack them. We then also have 3 Razorbacks that's carrying around an Inceptor squad as well as a pair of 5 model Purifier squads to give them additional AP bonuses. And then those guys also are getting a nice twin las cannon shot plus a hunter killer missile. Those will also benefit from the Warpbane Task Force reroll. So you're getting basically 2 anti-tank shots with almost full rerolls. You're rerolling at least once to hit, potentially full hit rerolls, and then at least the wound roll and the twin las cannon on the turn that you fire their hunter killers. So the 3 Razorbacks with their powers combined can do some serious anti-tank damage. You're also then following that up with a Godhammer pattern Land Raider with its own las cannon profiles plus a hunter killer missile, a multi-melta, and a heavy bolter. So with those rerolls built in, that's a lot of anti-tank shooting that you can pop out that you might not be expecting from a Grey Knight's army, which typically tends to engage at close range and only really deal anti-tank damage once they're in melee. But these guys are able to pick out 7 las cannon shots plus 4 hunter killer missiles, all of which are probably going to be hitting because of the rerolls that they get baked in, and that doesn't have to commit anything into the center of the battlefield. So if you do try to play a standoff game with them and just screen, they can peel your screens with the Purifiers and then poke at you with the longer range guns, force you to come forward, and then potentially Hallowed Beacon in their Purifier squads and do some serious damage towards the middle to late game. Really interesting build. I always like to see David Ozawa and his weird takes on Grey Knights because I think it's very non-standard. It's pretty cool to see. Definitely cool to see a Godhammer Land Raider, which is not something that you typically will be seeing in the current metagame these days. Now, with that, we're moving on over to Death Guard, who ended up taking down the Dragon's Reach GT. This was won by Mark Morrow, who was playing a Virulent Vectorium, and a pretty similar version to what we've been seeing, although it does have a very interesting inclusion. Now, we are rocking a Demon Prince of Nurgle with Revolting Regeneration, in addition to a Lord of Contagion with Furnace of Plagues, 1 Lord of Virulence, and Mortarion. Mortarion's a nice inclusion here. He oftentimes gets played because he can deep strike, so one thing you can do is try to set up either your offense with your ranged attacks by projecting his aura of contagion onto enemies after a rapid ingress, or you can set up closer charges with Death Rod Terminators by pushing him forward and then getting the enemies afflicted so that the Death Rod Terminators can charge. So hopefully you can combo attack with both the Death Rod Terminators and Mortarion at the same turn. However, the next thing we have here is 10 Blightlord Terminators, just a massive brick of Blightlords. The Lord of Virulence is going to give them wound rerolls with their ranged attacks. So these guys are going to put out actually an insane amount of shooting. Not to mention the fact that you're putting a massive brick of models into the center of the table. Hopefully, you can open up enough space with Mortarion and the Deshroud Terminators that they're able to pop in. And then if they're able to hold that territory with Virulent Victorium, you can obsec those objectives away. Not to mention the fact that trying to engage these guys with Mortarion around is going to be tough, because they can even use things like Fight on Death or reactive movements. That gets further compounded by the Demon Prince nearby, because he's going to provide them an aura of permanent cover, which is essentially, for that unit, like a free go-to-ground permanently all the time. And then they're going to, because they're infantry, grant him Lone Operative as well. So he's difficult to kill. He makes them more difficult to kill. You can be permanently covered. You can have the reactive abilities from Mortarion active. And then you can also have a 1 CP discounted from the Demon Prince, -1 damage on that unit. So incredibly sticky to kill. If you don't kill them, they obsec your objectives, or they just shoot you to death, because a full reroll with that unit actually does absolutely nuts damage. And now last, but certainly not least, keeping on the chaos theme for a moment here, we have Ryan McLeod taking down the Winter Assault GT with Emperor's Children. This was a Court of the Phoenician list running Fulgrim. Court of the Phoenician did get its nice little quality of life update to make its detachment ability slightly easier to use. It now no longer worries about enemies charging, or units charging into the same enemy. Now it only cares about whether or not they've attacked, which is good. Makes the detachment ability slightly more effective, which is very nice. In this case, we are running the big man himself, the Demon Primarch, in addition to 3 Lords Exultant and a Lord Cacophonist. We are running 3 Infractor units for the Lord Exalteds to hop into, as well as 2 Tormentor units, 2 Chaos Rhinos. From there, and this is interesting, that we basically eschewed all of the Demon Princes that we would typically take in these Emperor's Children lists in order to make space for Fulgrim. But once you do cut those Demon Princes, Fulgrim is he's less cost than 2 Winged Demon Princes at this point, but that does give you a pretty solid space to fit a lot of other units, Emperor's Children units. That includes 2 Maulerfiends and 3 Noise Marine squads that can embark into the transports after the Infractors pop out. So we have lots of utility between the Tormentors. We have 1 unit that can start up in the center of the table to try to obsec the midboard objectives, as well as 1 that can obsec your home objective. We do have a Chaos Spawn unit that can push up and fulfill some utility roles after them. And then we have those Maulerfiends that can unlock all of the demon synergies that this detachment uses. So things like the ability to move through walls and project the charge reroll aura that demons can use in this detachment. They're definitely, I think, the unsung heroes of the Court of the Phoenician. Then you also have Fulgrim, who can discount some of his stratagems and then also come in the late game and do some serious damage on top of that. The very upper echelon quite yet. We'll see if that changes moving on. Definitely with the rise of a lot of these character units, like things like these Victrix Honor Guard, for example, enemy Greater Demons, for example, as well. We talked about Greater Demons quite a bit. The ability to pay 2 CP for full rerolls on any unit is kind of big, because it's going to affect most of your opponent's frontline combat units, which can be a huge buff for this detachment. And with that, those are all the best armies in Warhammer 40k for this week. Thanks so much for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to everybody who supports Tactical Tortoise, whether that's over on Patreon at patreon.com/tacticaltortoise, or as a YouTube channel member. There's a bunch of new games from the Tennessee Elite Open available for YouTube channel members if you want to watch some more gameplay from top-level team events. Some absolutely barn-burner games over there. In addition to that, folks who are over on Twitch, as Twitch subscribers who help me keep the lights on for my regular live streams during the week. On top of our sponsor for this week, the Friendly Fire Team. Big thanks to them for sponsoring. Thanks to you for watching all the way to the end. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.